All right.
So whenever you're dealing with ultra-fast pulses, it's something that you kind of pick up as you're going along, but they are really the ultra-fast pulses are the shortest events ever created, or you could even argue that they're the shortest events that ever happened. Um, you can't ever make anything shorter than it because it's literally as short as you can get. Um, but when you have that issue, you also have to consider that when you're trying to measure pulses, the only way to do it is to measure it with something that's either shorter than the original pulse, or in most cases, you actually use the pulse itself to measure itself. So this is showing kind of the results of what would happen if you try to do the latter. So it's something called an autocorrelation, or specifically an intensity autocorrelation, but it doesn't really matter. It's an autocorrelation means you're just correlating the pulse's properties with itself. And so it's showing kind of the theoretical results in this picture of what would happen when there's certain distortions in time that are really, you can't get around them. They're gonna be in your pulses no matter what. It's just a fundamental law of nature. But this is what you're going to see unless you develop a much more sophisticated way of measuring your pulse in time, which is probably not something that you guys need to do. So figure A, or the left column, I should say, is showing a theoretically perfectly compressed laser pulse. By compressed, I mean that all colors in it, or all wavelengths, are arriving at exactly the same time. So if you look at the very bottom, you can see what's called the spectrogram. It's showing basically all wavelengths are perfectly aligned in a vertical line on the plot. So that's the ideal situation. You're never really going to get that unless you're using relatively long pulses. By relatively long, I mean like hundreds of femtoseconds, maybe even picoseconds. But that's not going to work for 3-photon microscopy. So you're never going to get that. You're going to be shooting for the shortest pulses possible. So the second one is something called group velocity dispersion, or sometimes you'll hear it called group delay dispersion. Sometimes you'll hear it group velocity dispersion. So I think if you looked at my dissertation, I use GVD, but GDD is just as common. So this is a phenomenon that happens whenever you put a short pulse through any material that doesn't have an index of refraction of 0 or 1. I can't remember. I haven't thought about it in so long. Basically, if you put it through anything, air, you put it through glass. So if you put it through a lens, it's going to accumulate something called group delay dispersion. Going into the actual details about what this is, I mean, it's probably not necessary for what you guys are going to be doing, but it's just really all you're doing is you're causing the colors in the light to not arrive at exactly the same time. So you can't really see it in the spectrogram here, and there's a fundamental reason. It's because it's an autocorrelation. But what's happening in the background is that, let's say, I guess you can see my video camera too. Kind of need to wave my hands a little bit.
Oh yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
So if you're kind of thinking on the same, if you look at the bottom of the plot where it's time versus wavelength. So think of this axis as time, this is wavelength. So in reality, in the second column, the laser pulse itself looks something like this. It's a linearly changing wavelengths versus time. It could either look like this or it could look like that. One of them is negative dispersion, one of them is positive dispersion. But when you do the actual measurement with the autocorrelation, you're measuring the pulse with itself. So you're kind of taking two pulses that are angled and you're crossing them in time, and they're interacting with each other. And so the interaction actually occurs only when they're overlapped in time. So the thing to remember is that because they're the same pulse, you're going to have, say, maybe the red end of one pulse is interacting with the blue end of the pulse. And so as you wipe it across, when you get to the other side, it becomes the same thing. And so what happens is you can't actually resolve the colors directly when you're using an autocorrelation. So what you end up with is this still looks like a symmetric signal, but it's now broader, and it's broader by the same gap in your two wavelengths. So the longest gap between your red end and your blue end are going to change the width of this pulse. So there are more refined ways of actually getting spectrograms that are pretty much beyond the scope of what you guys are going to be doing. That's stuff I did in grad school, but it's probably really not that important for what you're doing. But the point they're making in this paper is that, you know, if you can always calculate the fundamental limit of how short a pulse should be. All you really need to do that is to know the bandwidth. You can literally just measure the spectrum. So the larger the bandwidth of the pulse, the theoretically shorter it's going to be. And if you measure your pulse using an autocorrelation and it's longer than that theoretical limit, that means that you've either accumulated GDD or you've accumulated higher orders. In reality, you're always going to be accumulating both GDD and higher orders. But when you have a relatively narrow band pulse, one that would have a theoretical limit of maybe 30, 40 femtoseconds, you can pretty much limit it. It's mostly going to be GDD that you have to worry about. But when you start going to broadband pulses and really short pulses, then the higher order stuff is coming into play. So the first higher order thing is the third order dispersion, so the TOD, which you can see in the third column. And so now, instead of being a linear relationship between wavelength and time, you have something that's going to actually be quadratic, so it'll look like that. And so it's much harder to actually envision what's happening. But when you cross these two C shapes in time, you end up something that has the lobe shape down at the bottom. And then finally, in what happens in reality is that you're always going to be accumulating both GDD and third order dispersion. So you get something with that weird, I don't know, what you call it, frontal lobe shape. So that's what you're going to measure when you do an intensity autocorrelation in theory. And it's really just a quick and dirty way of seeing whether you have third order dispersion, because really the point of this paper is to tell you that you want to minimize both GDD and third order dispersion. But in practice, the way you would do this is with a prism compressor. So can I actually share my screen?
Yes. Yeah.
So just to give an example, this here is for my dissertation. It's a schematic of what GDD would be, or GVD is how I'm leaving it here. So you can see that in time, the color of the light is changing. So we start off with, in this case, we're starting off on the positive end of the pulse, it's purple, and then by the time we get to the end, it's red. So this is a linear trace in time. But
sorry, can I ask one question for that?
Sure.
Yeah. What does it mean, the minus in the time domain?
So it's really, I just kind of arbitrarily said that the center of the pulse is 0 time. It doesn't really matter. You could put 0 over here you wanted to, and then this would be 0 all the way up to 70 or whatever it is. It's just an arbitrary convention. So here's actually an example that I took in grad school of a pulse that has strong third order dispersion. So you can see that's the spectrogram, but now because I did a different and more advanced technique, we can actually resolve the pulse. So you can see that it has this quadratic shape to it. There's also going to be linear dispersion underneath of it, but the quadratic dispersion, or the TOD, is actually dominating in this case. So in reality, when you're trying to do experiments, you're going to have to come to some kind of compromise between getting rid of third order dispersion and first order dispersion, or GDD. So sorry if I keep changing terms. I'm used to calling it first order dispersion, but most people call it GDD. So really, in reality, when you try to compress your pulses, and there's lots of different ways to do it, you're just going to have to come to some compromise. So the most common way of doing it would be to use, let's see if I can rotate this. There's got to be a way to rotate this. Use something called a prism compressor. And I'm pretty sure this is what your setup is going to have. It's by far the way the most common, and it's the easiest to use too. So the thing about a prism compressor is that even though it's easy to use, you can't get rid of both can't get rid of both GDD or third order dispersion at the same time. You can only get rid of one. So you're probably going to come to some compromise and just get it as short as you possibly can. So the idea of a prism compressor is pretty simple. You have your laser pulse coming in. You can see here that we have a pulse it has a lot of GDD. It's linearly sloped in time. It comes through, goes through the tip of a prism, which then disperses it into its different colors. You have a second prism that's set up at exactly the same angle relative to the beam. So what happens is it stops the colors from separating any farther. So if you just projected this side farther along, it would just be like a rainbow beam. And the old way of doing it is that you actually had two more prisms over here, one there, and it just kind of does the exact opposite. But the easiest thing to do is actually to back reflect it. So you just have a flat mirror, send it perfectly backwards, and now it's coming in the opposite direction. So it's just going to counteract exactly what it did before. And so it just sends it back down, all the colors recombine, second prism stops it, and then it comes out as the laser beam that you started with. But the path length of the different colors in here are actually going to be different. So you can see that the red is going to be going through more glass, and glass is going to delay the pulse. So also the physical distance between the prisms surfaces is a little bit different too. But it's more important that it's going through more glass. So by changing both the distance between the prisms and moving the prisms back and forth in the beam, you can actually change the exact amount of GDD and third order dispersion accumulated by this thing. So it's always going to be negative GDD, which is good because negative is going to counteract with the positive GDD that you're always accumulating. Every time the pulse goes through anything, air, it's going to be positive GDD. So you need something like this to give negative GDD to get rid of it. And you can see by the time that we get back, this is set up in such a perfect situation that all of the colors now arrive at exactly the same time. So this is a very common thing. But if you have a larger bandwidth, say it goes all the way out to here, and you're going to have third order dispersion, you can't get rid of it. You can get rid of one, you can't get rid of both. There are ways of getting rid of both, but it's not going to be practical for what you need. You actually need to have both a prism compressor and a second type of compressor. So you need something like a grading compressor. And then you have to combine them both to make it perfect, which is really difficult to do. And it's very inefficient in terms of how much light gets through. So you're gonna lose a lot of power, which is not good for this experiment. So the paper is basically, in any practical setup you're going to be using, is probably going to have a prism compressor. And in the end, I'm guessing what you'll do is you'll look at your sample, you'll look at the fluorescence signal coming off of it, the 3-photon fluorescence, and you'll just play with the prism compressor until you get the brightest signal. So the paper goes into excruciating detail, but I think in reality, this is what all you're ever going to do is just move one of these prisms back and forth.
I see. And we'll be using the autocorrelator to calibrate this? Is that?
So probably the first time that we set this up, we'll use an autocorrelator. But once it's set up, I mean, the amount of dispersion that's going to be accumulated is not going to change very much. I mean, unless you're changing the optics a lot, which I don't think you will be, it's pretty much going to be the same. So probably, I'm guessing what you'll do, and I could be wrong, but I'm guessing you'll just put some kind of sample down that you know has a nice stable fluorescent signal, and you'll just compress the pulse until it's as bright as possible. So I suspect that's what you're going to do, and you don't really care in the end how short the pulse is. The paper is going into detail about, this is how short it actually is. You don't really care about that.
But is that something that once we have optimized, it'll translate to different samples, different animals, or is this something that we'll have to fiddle around with each time?
I imagine that you'll probably have to fiddle with it a little bit. The more tissue that you're going through, it's going to accumulate a little bit of GDD. I honestly have absolutely no idea off the top of my head how much GDD is going to be accumulated in animal tissue.
Right.
I'm used to thinking about glass or air, but it's going to. I mean, everything does. So you'll probably have to re-optimize it every time you put it down. I mean, it'll give you something. It's just you're going to want to make it as good as possible. And also, you might have presets for changing the objective lens. So if you're changing to a different objective lens, it's going to change the amount of material going through quite substantially. So what I'm guessing is that you'll calibrate it for each objective lens, and then just say, whenever we change this, move the prism to a certain position.
Well, on top of that, we're looking into putting a grin lens on the animal, so that's going to be even more complicated then.
Yeah. Well, I mean, in practice, what you do is you get your signal, whatever it may be, and just optimize it. I mean, that's the same thing I do on a day-to-day basis in the labs.
Yeah.
If I actually care about optimizing, which a lot of times they don't. They're just like, it's good enough. But for you guys, you definitely need to make it relatively optimized, because you're actually having a 3-photon interaction occurring. So the reason why any of this stuff works is because the pulses are so short in time that you actually have the ability to have multiple photons interact with each other. So if you think about it, an ultrafast laser pulse, I mean, the laser itself is, 70 watts is actually a fairly powerful laser for an ultrafast laser, but it's not absurd. 70 watts is like a light bulb, a low wattage light bulb. But all of that energy is not continuous across it. It's crammed into very short packets. So, you can calculate it very easily how much energy is created in each packet. It's probably going to be in the order of tens of microjoules for this laser, I think, going at megahertz or whatever it was. Which doesn't sound like much. It's microjoules not very much, but remember that microjoule pulse is 100 femtoseconds long. So if you actually do the math, the peak energy or the peak power in that is comparable to how much power a city is using, the total electrical power. So it's huge. It's it's gigawatts. And that's why all of this stuff actually works. So it's the same thing for the 3-photon microscope, is that it's even more sensitive to how long the pulse is in time, because you need to cram all those photons into the shortest amount of time as possible. And the more it's smeared out in time, the more uncompressed the pulse is, the less likely these high-order nonlinear interactions are going to occur. So that's really the whole point of doing the compression, is that you're just trying to make the not usual nonlinear reactions actually possible. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Okay, so I think we can go back to the paper. I think I just stop sharing, don't I? So this figure is just kind of giving you a theoretical idea of what you would see if you did an intensity autocorrelation, which we'll probably do at some point, or possibly not. It might just be that you plop your sample in there and the signal's good enough, and it's just, let's go with it.
So next figure then?
Yeah. So this one is actual real data, I think. So they're actually measuring real pulses with their setup. And so you can see in the upper left, let's see. Yeah, so that's their real spectrogram that they calculated, and it matches most closely with the bottom right from figure 1. So that means that they have both GDD and third order dispersion, which is, I could have told you that was going to happen from the beginning, because the second it goes through anything, it's going to have both.
Yeah.
I mean, even straight out of the laser, which actually might be how they measured this, if I remember correctly, it already has both. And if you think about it, it's because the laser itself, it's going through optics, so it's going to be accumulating inside of the laser cavity and inside anything that it's passing through and coming out. So the upper left is what you'd actually look like in real life.
Well, are you saying that they're measuring this after the objective or even before?
So I think if I remember correctly, from reading the paper,
Must be just from the laser directly.
I think this is directly right outside the laser. They're just going straight into the autocorrelator.
Yeah.
So if you could theoretically do this at the sample position, which would be pretty difficult just because you have to actually access the beam.
Mhm.
But if you could, it would be even more pronounced. You would have accumulated more dispersions. So B is just, it looks like it's I think that's just the summed intensity. So I think what they're doing is that they're actually just, on the, I guess you can't see my mouse, but if you take figure A and you just sum up each vertical axis, then they're just showing that as a projection on part B, I believe. So what you see with third order dispersion, you'll see that little extra bump sometimes. It's just the way it's going to show up. So C is showing both the intensity trace and the phase. Let's see, I think so. Yeah, so it's showing the spectral intensity and the phase. And so you guys really don't need to worry about the actual phase. You don't really need to do this on a day-to-day basis. And in fact, even when I was doing experiments in grad school where I did really care about how short the pulses were, we didn't measure the phase on a day-to-day basis. We just, practically speaking, just made the pulse as short as possible. But you can actually see the phase here, and you can see that it's cubic. So if you go back to the earlier in the paper, it has some of the equations. It shows the phase as a Taylor series expansion around the centered frequency, and the third order dispersion is going to be a cubic phase, and so that's why it's showing up as cubic, because we have third order dispersion. So part D looks like it's an analytical modeling. So I think what if I remember, is that they're just kind of arbitrarily saying, what would it look like if we got rid of all of the third order dispersion? And they're showing that whenever you have third order dispersion, it's going to make the pulse longer in time, which is always true. Any dispersion is going to make it longer in time. And so I think part E it's showing how much better you could get if you completely get rid of the third order dispersion. So the red is with the third order dispersion, and the blue is if you could somehow just completely get rid of third order dispersion. But as I already talked about with the prism compressor, you can't get rid of both. You can only get rid of one or the other. So this is a theoretical concept here. So the limit, that 31 femtoseconds, is something called the Fourier transform limit. Most people would just call it transform limit. So if you know the bandwidth of the pulse, you can always just take the Fourier transform of it and get the theoretical limit of the pulse in time. So it's how fast it could possibly be given perfect circumstances, which you'll never achieve. But in this case, the Fourier transform limit for this particular bandwidth would be 31 femtoseconds. But in reality, when you do the experiment, you're going to be getting something more like 43, which is still pretty good. It's just going to make the fluorescence slightly less bright.
Yeah. So maybe this is something you alluded to in the beginning, but from the first two figures, they're just looking at properties of this laser, this instrument, right?
Yeah. So I mean, that's all this paper is they're measuring the properties of the laser pulses, the wavelength versus time properties. That's all it really is.
Of their particular system.
Yeah, but you're going to get something that's pretty similar.
Yeah.
I mean, the numbers that they're showing here are not atypical.
And would this be a function of the laser and the OPA that they have, and so that if we got it from a different company, then it might look different?
Yeah, but it's basically going to be the same. I mean, if the company is not bad at designing their lasers, they're going to minimize the amount of glass that's going through, or they're going to have some kind of internal compression system inside of the NOPA, which I believe the NOPA actually does, if I remember correctly. Mm-hmm. But from talking to Art, I think he thinks we might have to have an external one too, an external prism compressor.
Yeah.
But if it's the same NOPA that I'm used to using, because it's the Spirit system, it should have its own internal compressor.
Yeah.
But you're basically going to get the same results for any professionally built laser. I mean, they're going to be slightly different, but more importantly is how much glass is going on outside the laser itself and how much material you're passing through.
But then so far it seems that this information might be new to us, but for you guys, this must all be very basic stuff.
It's basic in the sense that it's something that you're aware of on a day-to-day basis. We don't usually go into this much detail. Like I said, we don't really go into the spectral phase and measure it. It's a pain in the ass to do that, actually. But we might, if you have an instrument, a commercial frog measurement or frequency resolved optical gating, then yeah, you might actually do it and just see what it looks like. It's not too difficult. And then what you would do in practice is you would park the thing on the table. You would look at the frog measurement, the results, say like what the part A looks like up there. And then you would just fiddle with the compressor until it's minimized. And that's in practice what you guys are going to be doing. So I think we can go to the next figure unless you guys have other questions. So this one, I think this is another theoretical calculation. So all they're really showing is that as you accumulate more third order dispersion, so as you climb the y-axis in this, think of it as your laser pulses have gone through more glass and it's accumulated more third order dispersion. It's basically just showing you that your pulse length is going to be longer. That's really all this figure is showing. So it's giving you hard numbers here. So you can actually look up pretty much any common material that's available used in optics. You can look up how much the third order dispersion accumulation will be per like millimeter of it. So if you have a lens that's 50 millimeters thick, you can calculate exactly how much third order dispersion you're going to accumulate and exactly how much GDD you're going to accumulate. On a day-to-day basis, I don't actually do this. I mean, if I was really going to design a compressor from scratch, I would probably, I might do this calculation, but in practice, I kind of already know pretty much what the prism compressor is going to be, so I know how to set it up. And if it's wrong, you can just rebuild it again. But all this figure is showing is that third order dispersion is a bad thing. If you accumulate a lot of it, it's going to make your pulse long.
So next one.
Yep. So this one, when I first looked at it, I was a little confused. So this is actually not looking at the pulse length anymore. So what they did is they came up with a technique for measuring not the shot-to-shot intensity, but basically what they're doing is they're capturing the intensity of sequential laser pulses in their output. So the laser outputs pulses, obviously it's going to output a pulse train. I think yours is outputting it once every microsecond. Excuse me, not microsecond. Yes, microsecond. Once every microsecond, if it's a megahertz laser. So what they're doing is they have a photodiode set up to capture the intensity of each pulse, and then they're kind of showing it as a measurement of. Let's see. Actually, I might remember this wrong. So can you go to the next figure actually real quick?
Yeah.
See if I can remember. Okay, so it's all basically the same thing. Maybe we'll just go to this one because it's actually showing what it's doing. So what they're showing is that fluctuations in the pulse train intensity are going to show up in your actual microscope image as artifacts. And so in the top left, they're showing something that's pretty normal. I mean, they've measured, what they've done is they've actually stuck a photodiode down in front of the laser beam, and they showed that when it's relatively stable, there's not any weird jumps in the signal. When you actually would, create an image from this, so I believe the way that the microscope works is that it raster scans. So you can think of it as like in part B, it's going to start in the upper left corner. It's It's going to collect for each pixel a certain number of laser shots. It's going to turn that into a brightness pixel, and then it's going to move to the next pixel to the right, the next pixel to the right. When it gets to the end, it's going to go down to the next row, and so forth. So I think what they did here is that they linearly measured on the left side the shot intensity, and then they converted that into a raster scan of what you'd actually see in a real image. So as you see in the top row, it's nice, clean, not a whole lot of noise in the signal. I mean, obviously there's some fluctuations. You're always going to have fluctuations, but there's no really like unusual artifacts that jump out at you. And so you'll have a pretty normal background in your signal. But if you jump down to the next part, it's showing that on a certain time scale, there's this weird jump in there that could be caused by, I don't know, air current fluctuation, or there's lots of different things that can cause noise in your pulse train. Vibrations on the table, if you bump the laser and all of a sudden there's a slight vibration inside the cavity and you make it less efficient for creating laser pulses, and all of a sudden the power just drops a little bit. You might get a temporary, weirdness in the pulse train, and so that would show up on the right side in your image as these streaks. So they're raster scanning from left to right or right to left. I don't know which one, but you can see that whenever there's a weird dip in it, it's going to just show up as a smaller signal for a short amount of time.
Yeah.
And then the last thing is it's the same kind of fluctuations, just on a longer time scale. So you can see the middle one is on fraction of a millisecond time scale, whereas on the bottom it looks like it's tens of milliseconds. And so that's going to show up as weird streaks as well, but it's just going to be on a different scale on your image. So there's nothing like super exciting about what they're doing here. I think they did it in two different ways. They have a single photodiode where they literally just put the laser beam onto the photodiode. They put the photodiode signal into an oscilloscope, and then they just measure it over time. And so what happens is they end up with the signals to the left. So that's literally, they just measured every single pulse on the pulse train for over a 200 millisecond time scale. They also talked about, and I didn't fully understand exactly how they did it, but they had one where they were more accurately showing what it's going to be like for a 3-photon measurement. So I think they talked about some kind of a filter on the front of the photodiode that would only let through, I think, a 3-photon interaction on it. So I think what they were doing is basically measuring the same type of interaction that you'd see in the 3-photon microscope. So maybe what they were doing is that they were literally focusing it down onto the photodiode surface, and there was actually 3-photon nonlinear interaction happening, which causes a different color light to come out. So I think that's what they did. So that's in reality what you actually care about in the 3-photon microscope, is because that's the noise you're going to be looking at. But none of this stuff is super, it's not going to be stuff you're doing every day. I don't think you're ever going to be measuring the stability of the pulse train directly. It's not a bad idea to do it maybe at the very beginning if art is around and they can fiddle with the inside of the laser, because it certainly will make your signals look good on a short time scale. But when art is not here, there's really not much we can do other than make sure that there's no air currents blowing through the room. Make sure the table's floated properly so the vibrations are better than they would be. But you're not going to be doing this type of measurement on a day-to-day basis. But it just shows you that it is important to have the pulse train stability as good as possible. But when they set up the laser, that's like the first thing they're going to do is make sure it's within specs. So I guess next figure.
Is that it? There's some supplemental figures.
Oh, that's it?
Yeah.
Oh, wow. There's more text than figures.
Yeah.
Yeah, so, I mean, the paper, oh, sorry, go ahead.
It's basically just setting up, right?
Yeah, and I mean, I don't even know if you need to do these type of measurements when you're setting up. I mean, to me, the measuring the pulse train seems to be more something you would do if you're having problems, like the signal quality you're getting out is not what you'd expect. And then you might be like, well, maybe it's because the pulse train is unstable. We can look at the time scale of the fluctuations, and then maybe come up from, figure out where the noise is coming from. So if it's, say, something that's coming out at 60 hertz, we might be able to say, well, there's probably an electrical issue. It's coming from there's some kind of noise coming from the wires in the room, and then we can figure out from there. But if you're not seeing, weird backgrounds in your signal, then I don't think you really need to take the time to do this type of experiment. It's actually kind of a pain to get a pulse-to-pulse measurement, and I don't think you probably don't have an oscilloscope that's capable of measuring data for a long period of time. So actually, it's reading this paper, there was one section they were talking about, they were working with the laser engineers on optimizing the pulse train, and it's almost exactly the same thing that I did with pretty much might be the identical laser with the lower power with art. So I was wondering if they were doing this directly with art and doing it a different way, because we were doing the same type of measurement with a high-speed camera for the Wazalewski group, because we're having noise issues on a different time scale, but for a completely different reason. So the one thing the paper talks about when it's talking about the noise is that they're measuring directly out of the laser. The reason why I think that it's going to be less relevant for you guys to do that is that it doesn't mention that there's secondary sources of noise outside of the laser cavity itself. The main source of noise that you're going to have is when you're generating, when you're going through the NOPA. So when you're converting the fundamental laser wavelength into the idler signal, but I think of it as the visible beam and the idler, but you only use the idler. So the whole point of the NOPA is to change the wavelength to something that's actually more useful and broader bandwidth, because the laser itself, I think, only has a pulse duration that's like 350 femtoseconds or something, which to you guys probably sounds really fast. To me, it sounds really slow. So the NOPA will generate broader bandwidth pulses and also at a different wavelength. But the way that it does this is it actually focuses the fundamental into a crystal, and it goes through some very complicated nonlinear interaction. But what actually happens is you generate white light. It literally goes from this really narrowband thing to a super broadband, what's called a white light continuum. And then that white light continuum is then put into the NOPA, and it's amplified by the residual fundamental. So that's kind of I think what's being shown here. No, that's the frog setup.
Yeah, this is the frog setup.
Yeah, they probably don't have a diagram of the NOPA. The NOPA is quite complicated, but it's a well-established commercial instrument. So you guys really won't be messing with that too much. But my point is that the main source of noise, I'm thinking, is going to be coming from the continuum generation step. So it's this crazy nonlinear interaction where you're actually like self-filamenting inside of the crystal. And so there's all sorts of thermal things that are going on. If the crystal is heating up too much, it's going to cause fluctuations. That's really what's going to be the limiting step. So if you have beam pointing stability anywhere from vibrations on the table, it's going to cause massive fluctuations. If the pulse is fluctuating a lot in intensity, it's just going to amplify everything. So to me, that's the main thing you have to worry about, is that step, and not from the laser itself. But you could argue that if the laser itself is not reacting within specs, it's fluctuating a lot, then that's just going to cause the continuum to be even worse. So I guess both steps are important, but what they measured here seems to be less relevant in my practical opinion. So when I was talking about working with art for the measurements, is we actually found that the laser itself was well within its RMS stability. I mean, I think it was like 0.3% RMS stability, something like that, and it's quoted at like under 2. So it was great, but the continuum generation step was not stable. It was not. It was still pretty stable, but it wasn't as stable as a previous laser that we had. So there's all sorts of things that can cause the instability. So I don't think you're going to be doing this on a day-to-day basis, but if there is a problem, maybe we can set something like this up.
Yeah. First of all, yeah, thank you for going over the figures. I think it makes much more sense than before. even an hour ago.
I mean, it's a lot of this stuff is just, it's a practical thing. Once you learn how to do it, you'll never even really think about these type of measurements. So a lot of times when you're compressing a pulse, you're not going to actually spectrally resolve it. You're just going to create the second harmonic signal that they talk about with the autocorrelation. You literally just look at the blue light that's coming out of it and just by eye compress the pulse until the blue light's as bright as it possibly can be. I think you're going to be doing an analog of that. Is you're just going to be looking at the 3-photon fluorescence signal and just getting it as bright as it can possibly be.
Yeah.
So it's important to understand, what's going on in the background, why this stuff is happening. But in practice, I don't think you're going to be doing stuff as complicated as this.
Mm-hmm.
And I could be wrong, but hopefully I'm not.
Well, that was going to be my next question. When Jahao, my postdoc, starts doing this, how much optics knowledge will he need versus can he just pick up the phone and call you? That's a problem.
I mean, I am willing to come over whenever you guys need. Just be aware that I do have to charge for time. So,
right.
I mean, I love doing this stuff. But I think it's probably going to be, you set it up once, we're going to optimize it, and then for the most part, you guys are going to be doing it yourself. I mean, you're not going to be changing the paths all that much. It's going to be going to the microscope. Yeah, I suspect you'll probably change the objective lens to get a different resolution and stuff like that. But that's really just rotating a wheel.
Yeah.
Once it's set up, I think it's, unless something happens, it's going to be pretty much just plunk your sample in there, make sure that the beam is compressed, and we'll do it just the way I was just describing. Just look at the fluorescent signal and maximize it. So I'm guessing on a day-to-day basis, that's what you guys are going to be doing, but I could be wrong. I mean, the 3-photon is a higher order experiment that I'm used to using. There might be more problems that pop up that I'm not aware of. I mean, clearly that's not a common instrument. So,
well, we're certainly excited to get this in and play with it. So, and I feel that we're very fortunate to have you around and on board to help us out. So whatever capacity that may be, we'll continue to work on it.
Sounds good.
Yeah. Well, again, thank you for spending all this time to digest this paper for us.
Yeah, not a problem.
And I'll let you know when the installation is set up, so that it'd be great if you could come over and see what's going on.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, do you know who's installing it?
I'm not certain at this point, and there's all these complications about, like, the microscope is coming in from Wisconsin, and now they are a high risk state now, so that if they come in, they have to quarantine for 2 weeks before they can come to the lab. So I don't know how it's going to be done, but we'll figure something out.
Yeah. Well, just let me know. I mean, my schedule is pretty flexible, so.
Yeah, I'll definitely let you know, and we'll try to schedule it for a time that's convenient for you also.
All right.
All right. Thank you, Stephen.
Yep. Have a good weekend.
Thank you, Stephen.
Thank
Bye.
you.